Chapter 14, Forging the National Economy, 1790 to 1860. So this chapter kind of takes a break from our kind of like chronology here, and this chapter more or less just focuses on the economy. So that the time span 1790 to 1860, roughly speaking, that's kind of the time in between the American Revolution and the Civil War. So kind of that time frame, this chapter is kind of just focusing on economics. The intro talks about the fact that we are moving west, and we get a lot of immigrants that come in too at this time to America. It talks about how new farm machinery is leading to a revolution in agriculture, and how new factory machinery is leading to kind of the industrial revolution or revolution in industry. And it talks about also how now that we're expanding west, we're also building more roads, more canals, more railroads, making use of more steamships, kind of connecting our east to our west coast going on as well. And just really, it's just a dynamic time when it comes to our economy. There is tremendous growth at this time. So we're taking a whole chapter just to focus on that. Okay, the first section, the Westward movement. Okay, so the West was kind of considered the most uniquely American part of America. It kind of characterized America at this time, the western frontier. The eastern coast looked very kind of European, sort of. Not necessarily, but you know what I mean. But the western frontier was something that was very uniquely American. At this time we had a lot of young people, or I should say our population was quite young. By 1850, about half of the population was under the age of 30, and it was just kind of young, restless people with a lot of energy moving on west. So we kind of see a shift in population. So before, most of the population was on the eastern seaboard, and then by 1840, the center of the population was west of the Allegheny Mountains, and then by 1860, kind of the center of the population was even west of the Ohio River. So you can see we're slowly moving out west. And kind of like the legend of, the West being cleared by these buff axemen, I don't know if you had that picture in your mind, was untrue. Really, pioneer life, or life on the frontier, was really grim, you could say. People were poorly fed, poorly clothed, had poor shelter. Abraham Lincoln talks about spending a year more or less in his childhood living in kind of a shack that was kind of like a lean-to, so just very poor conditions, early death, lots of disease, and you were very isolated on the frontier. You're in the wilderness. So people would, this kind of isolation would almost lead to depression, because you're not seeing even your neighbors, and even sometimes madness, meaning people would literally go insane. And this was especially hard for women, and especially during the winter months. Think day after day, week after week, month after month, more or less stuck in, a log cabin. Cabin fever, maybe you've heard of that. It's a term we use in our culture, just meaning like anxious for spring to come. Well, people would literally go insane in extreme cases from all this isolation, and like I said, especially women. Women might not even see their neighbors for months at a time. So it was a grim life. They said men had rough forms of entertainment. They would watch these kind of no-holds-bar wrestling matches where people might lose a nose or an eye. Gross. Anyway. But, this isolation often led to being ill-informed about politics and about what's going on in the rest of the world. Superstitions, those were rampant. And, just very individualistic. This isolation made you very individualistic. And there's a kind of a term for this isolation, individualistic stuff, and that's called rugged individualism. Okay, and this kind of idea was popularized a lot in kind of the literature of the time. We get Ralph Waldo Emerson writing an essay about called Self-Reliance, talking about kind of like the spirit of individualism. A lot of literature characters at the time were kind of like isolated souls. You know, we have Ahab and Moby Dick. He's very isolated, kind of popularizing that idea. But you know, even if you were on the frontier and you didn't see your neighbors for a long period of time, you were kind of reliant on your neighbors once in a while. For example, barn raising, that's a job you clearly couldn't do by yourself, so neighbors would get together for that sort of thing. But really, people were very individualistic, but they did need help from time to time. Yeah. Okay, next section, shaping the Western landscape. So this kind of section is talking more or less about the environment and how this westward movement impacted the environment. Because it was kind of weird, because at one hand, Americans really admired the frontier. Remember, we thought it was like one of those characteristic parts of America, but on the other hand, we are more or less killing it as we moved west. And your book kind of highlights some changes that happened. They talked about a lot of times people would exhaust the land or kind of wear out the land in the east, and that would force them to go west. And then once they got west, they would change the land. Of course, we're chopping down trees, forests, that sort of thing. But also, for example, Kentucky. Yeah. Southern Kentucky was full of like 15-foot tall cane. When I say cane, it's actually kind of like a native bamboo of Kentucky. I bet you didn't know Kentucky had bamboo. Well, it was true. So what people would do, they'd come in, they'd burn these cane fields or bamboo fields, and then they would grow grass that would be used for then, you know, grazing cattle. Kentucky bluegrass, we've heard of that. Yeah, so that's kind of an example of how we changed the environment. Other things they talked about is, of course, the poor beaver. Everyone wants your fur, beaver, because you make really good hats. So this was still happening. Fur trading was still happening. We're killing more or less almost every single beaver we ever saw. And it was kind of, they would set up the system. So fur trappers would get all these beaver pelts, and then they would have something called the Rendezvous System, which is more or less, it was kind of a swap meet once a year in the summer. All of the fur traders would come with the pelts, and then people from the East Coast would come with manufactured goods, and they would swap. Okay, I'll give you, you know, one beaver pelt for that lovely, you know, kettle. I don't know. So it was a swap meet, the rendezvous system. French, rendezvous, French word for meeting. Yep, so that's wonderful. Other poor animals who kind of got the short end of the stick. Our buffalo were killed for their hides, and even in California, the poor little sea otters were murdered for their pelts. I mean, I guess if you're a cute little animal, we're just going to kill you. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So those were examples of something that the term for this kind of thing is called ecological imperialism, which is more or less kind of harming the natural resources through excessive hunting, logging, mining, grazing. So ecological imperialism wasn't just animals. It was cutting down trees, you know, burning the cane in southern Kentucky, grazing land, cutting down, I just said cutting down trees, that sort of thing, mining. So it was kind of like taking over and kind of using the natural resources almost to excess. Okay, so like I said, on the other hand, though, why we were kind of more or less killing the natural environment, we also really admired it. There was a lot of books and poems written about it. There was paintings created about it. And yeah, people were just kind of inspired. It was a defining characteristic of America. So someone you ought to know, his name is George Catlin. And what he was a painter, but he had an experience painter, I should say, probably didn't pronounce that clearly enough. He was a painter, but an experience he had just kind of appalled him. He saw on the frontier kind of just the reckless slaughter of buffaloes by the Native Americans, because the Native Americans would cut out the tongue of the buffalo and trade that with, you know, American traders to purchase to purchase whiskey or to buy whiskey. So George Catlin saw this and was just kind of appalled by it and kept seeing kind of the frontier, more or less, that beauty disappearing. So what he did is he brought forth the idea of the national park system, which is still around today. So even in 1872, Yellowstone National Park was created as just a way to preserve kind of that natural beauty that was so characteristic of America. So yeah, that's that. Excuse me. All right. Next section, the March of Millions. So now we're going to be talking more or less about immigration, why they came, that sort of thing. So cities at this time, their population, or the urban population, was really growing. You could say it was exploding. By 1860, there was over 43 cities that had over 20,000 people. In the Northwest, we had the big city of New York. In the South, we had the big city of New Orleans. In the Midwest, Chicago was just a booming. So we see a lot of growth in cities, but of course this brings with it its own set of problems. Okay, conditions were very unsanitary. The smell was bad. Street lighting was poor. There wasn't enough policemen around. Kind of impure water, ineffective garbage disposal, more or less just really unsanitary conditions. They were growing almost too fast, so to speak. But in general, it was a kind of a boom in the urban growth, but America was growing in general. America's population doubled every 25 years, kind of harkening back to that huge population growth we got during the colonies. By 1860, we had 33 states. By 1860, we were the fourth most populous country in in the West, meaning with Europe and America, that sort of thing. We were the fourth biggest, so we're really kind of growing quickly. And, it was an increase in the population rate, for one thing, in general, but more than that, it was really immigration. And there was a number of reasons why, at this time, there was kind of this, bump in immigration. Europe was more or less running out of room, okay? So, say you were young, grew up on a farm, now you're off on your own, you can't find any cheap farmland, what do? You head out. You go to America, you go elsewhere. So, Europe was running out of room, but not everyone who left Europe came to America. Okay, people went to Australia, people went to South Africa, people went to Argentina, but America was a very popular destination point for these kind of extra people, if you will, that were in Europe. A lot of times relatives that went to America would send these letters home, these American letters, saying kind of how great America was, encouraging family and friends to come on over. They're saying, there's no aristocracy here. There's no state church here. There's a lot of available land. There's lower taxes. There's no compulsory military service. And people came to America because really it was the cheapest place to go to. We have steamships now that made, one, transportation cost less, and two, a trip that used to take 10 to 12 weeks to get through, going from Europe to America used to take 10 to 12 weeks. Now, because of the steamboats, it only took 10 to 12 days. And this kind of led to a huge diversity in America. Kind of the first time we've seen this in the history of the world, this diversity, people coming from all over and living under kind of one roof, so to speak. Okay, next section, then now that we kind of talked about immigration in general and why they came, we're going to be talking about two specific groups. This next section then is, of course, the Emerald Isle, talking about our friends the Irish. So the Emerald Isle moves west. We're not talking about Irish people moving to like the frontier west. When we say the Emerald Isle moves west, we're saying moving to America. And why did they move to America? Well, specifically, of course, this wouldn't be an American history class if we didn't talk about the Irish potato famine. So the potato famine happened in the 1840s, and Ireland is kind of known as the Black 40s. this potato famine happened for a number of reasons, one of which Ireland, more or less, their staple crop, or like the only crop they grew, was the potato. So when this kind of rot of sorts started to come around, it just devastated their economy, for one thing. And people just starved. It was a famine. Over 2 million people will die over the next 20 years in Ireland due to this famine. So they come on over, and a lot of them settle on the East Coast and settle in cities. Because frankly, by the time they got to America, they were out of money. They didn't have enough money to head to the frontier and to buy land. So they're more or less kind of just stuck in these cities on the eastern seaboard. Specifically, they talked about a huge population of Irish in Boston and New York. Over this kind of course of time, there'll actually be more Irishmen who live in New York City than live in Dublin. So this is just a huge migration of Irish to these eastern cities. And, you know, America wasn't that welcoming. Women would maybe find work as kind of like kitchen maids. Men would kind of do just the grunt work. They would work on canals, building railroads, oftentimes dying of disease or accidental explosions. And, you know, they were just kind of looked down upon. One, they were poor, and two, they were Catholic, both of which are not good things to a lot of the people who had been living in America for a while. And they were also kind of seen as, you know, the Irish were kind of cheap labor, which kind of depressed the wages of everyone else. So say someone would work for a week for $5, well, hey, the Irish guy would work for a week for only $2, which kind of lowered the price overall of labor. Kind of understand what I'm saying here. And of course, the Irish then were kind of on the bottom of the heap when it came to getting jobs. So the Irish are actually a lot of times in direct competition with free blacks to kind of get those bottom of the barrel jobs. So during the Civil War, we'll see that the Irish were a lot of times not really, how should we say it? They were not supporters of the abolitionist movement or the free the slaves movement, because they felt if the slaves were freed, you know, even more slaves were freed, they'd even have more competition for the jobs they had. All right, let's keep going. But the Irish, you know, they didn't get a lot of help from Americans, but they try to help each other out the best they can. They formed something called the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Hibernians is how you say that word. So the Ancient Order of Hibernians was kind of like a semi-secret society where, you know, they would help, there would be Irish people helping the recent Irish immigrants, you know, trying to get them jobs, getting them clothes, getting them shelter, that sort of thing. Also, the Maguires was organized. The Maguires was an Irish mining union that was secret and sometimes violent, but that was kind of forming as well. And eventually, however, once the Irish came, they became more involved with politics, which actually kind of increased their lot in life. Especially, or notably, there was a New York political machine called Tammany Hall, which we will definitely be talking about later. But this is how it would work. So these immigrants would support the Tammany Hall candidate for governor or president or, you know, town councilman. So the Irish or the immigrants would support the Tammany Hall candidates, and in exchange, Tammany Hall would help them find jobs, give them social services. So eventually in New York, the majority of the policemen were Irish because they're kind of got these jobs through supporting the Tammany Hall candidates, that sort of thing. I don't even know where I am. Yeah. And the Irish also, you have to understand, they hate the British because the Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom, thinking about England, that sort of thing. So they're a part of the British Kingdom. And think of this potato famine. There's this huge famine in Ireland, and England more or less doesn't even lift a finger to help out, you know, Ireland, which is a part of their kingdom, so to speak. So even, you know, fun fact, even in New York up to probably 10 years ago, As a teacher, you had to teach the Irish potato famine as an attack of the British against the Irish, because of the idea that the British could have helped out the Irish but chose not to. So the Irish hated the British, and they have a long history of, British harshly controlling or taking advantage of the Irish. So politicians at this time totally took advantage of the Irish's hatred for the British, and a lot of times political candidates in speeches will tear down the British. And of course all the Irish people cheer. It's like, British people are bad. Irish people are like, praise the Lord! Yay! Anyway, that was maybe excessive. Too bad. Let's talk about the next section. So the last section was about Ireland. This section is about the Germans. So these are kind of the two biggest groups of immigrants we get. So let's talk about the Germans and what they did. All right. Around the German 48ers. So these are people who came in 1848, or so they say. So between 1830 and 1860, there was about 1.5 million German immigrants that came. And, they weren't as far or as bad off as the Irish. So a lot of Germans were, once they came to America, were able then to purchase land on the frontier and became farmers. So Irish were more in the cities, and the Germans, you could say, then were more in, or more on the farm, or more on the frontier. So the Germans brought with them a lot of kind of things, inventions that we have adopted: the Kentucky rifle, the Christmas tree, the term even kindergarten. Kindergarten is a German word for children's garden. Also beer. Germans brought over and definitely popularized drinking beer in America, because we never had a beer rebellion in America. We had the whiskey rebellion, but the Germans brought us the beer. That's a fun phrase to say. And the Germans overall were better educated, which means they were definitely big supporters of public education, because they wanted their children to be educated as well. And they were all about freedom, so they really, really hated slavery. Remember, the Irish were more or less wanting to keep slavery around so that those free blacks wouldn't steal their jobs. Well, the Germans really hated slavery. They thought it was just bad news. All right, and often the Germans on these farms would kind of create more or less little German colonies. So as a way to try to preserve both their language and their culture, their way of life, they would have kind of these little German colonies, kind of like farms, so that that culture would stay true. It kind of stuck to themselves, sort of. I know Northwest Iowa, where I'm from, there's a lot of these kind of little German farm towns that are still around. Yeah, Germans. Okay, next section. This is going to be a long video. I talk a lot. Okay, flare-ups of anti-foreignism. Anti-foreignism. Okay, so the first term you should know in this section is the idea or the term of nativism. Nativism. Okay, nativism is kind of the fear and open opposition to immigration. So we have all these immigrants coming in. So in kind of effect, there's kind of this rise of anti-immigration, and that's called nativism, being people who are native to America, being against those who are coming in. Okay, natives didn't like immigration because of a couple things like we said. One, they felt it was a competition for their jobs, and two, a lot of these immigrants, mostly all the Irish, part of the Germans, were Catholic. They didn't like that. The Irish or the Catholics started to build these Catholic school system, which is saying something because these immigrants didn't have a lot of money, but they still built these Catholic schools to make sure that their kids weren't kind of Protestantized, so to speak. By 1850, Catholicism was the biggest religious group in America, and since that time, since the 1850s, Catholicism has been, or I should say has kept first place. So since 1850, Catholicism has been the biggest religion in America. And so there was a lot of kind of anti-Catholic stuff that grew out of this idea of nativism. There is the formation of an anti-Catholic party called the Know Nothing Party, and we'll talk about them later on with slavery. But what it is just a party, a political party of nativists who wanted stricter restrictions on immigration and wanted laws that would more or less deport all of those poor immigrants. And they promoted anti-Catholic literature. An example they said was a book called Awful Disclosures, and in this book it was supposedly the story of this ex-nun who is kind of just laying out all this horrible stuff that happened at the convent she lived in. And this, it sold 300,000 copies, just kind of showing the how popular nativism was in America, and also just kind of showing the fear a lot of Native Americans had because of this immigration. They were scared. They didn't know how to deal with it. So they write these horrible books. It's horrible. Other examples, there's examples of violence. In Philadelphia, there is this kind of, fight that left 2 Catholic churches burned, 13 died, 50 were wounded, and we saw on occasion just convents are burning, schools are burning, churches are being attacked. And, these were kind of infrequent, we could say, and usually happened in larger cities, but was kind of just showing that there was definitely conflict. The immigrants were not welcomed with, a bear hug. But really, the idea is, this is a huge thing. In America, this is the first time in the history of the world, all of these different groups of ethnicities are kind of blending together. And it's kind of surprising then there wasn't even more violence than there was. It's kind of surprising. You'd think there'd even be more conflict or more violence. But what your book said, and which I think is obviously then true, is that the thing was, the nation's economy was expanding so rapidly that it was able to kind of assume all of these immigrants without really displacing a lot of American jobs. Because we were growing so much, there was plenty of space, so to speak, for everyone in the economy. Yes. And really, our nation needed these immigrants. We were getting to the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the chapter, and we needed a lot more people to start working for us because our economy was expanding. So really, overall, it was a good thing for America. And with that, we're done with this video.